Thank you, Radwan, for
Morning.
organizing this. Thank you for all of my colleagues for joining and dedicating your time to discussing this book. I am very excited to hear what people have to say. Let me actually spend some time sharing a PowerPoint to help guide some of this. Let's see here. Am I allowed to share my screen on this?
Yes, there is a button at the
Yeah.
bottom, share screen.
Yep. Share screen. Okay. So here's the book. And it's a little bit unique in the sense that really Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi is the author of most of this book. You'll see that the book consists of 10 essays by Sheikh Rashid, translated into English for the first time. It also includes a somewhat lengthy introduction by me, which deals with the question of what is novel about the idea of Muslim democracy. So as many of the guests and participants will know, the concept of Muslim democracy has been around for quite a long time. The AKP in Turkey in the early 2000s branded itself as not an Islamist party or as aspiring to an Islamic state, but as a Muslim democratic party. Parties in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and elsewhere have been associated with this idea. And so the concept of Muslim democracy invokes or evokes a lot of different associations. One, the most obvious, is the idea of Christian democracy in Europe. And when you understand it in that context, you get the sense that the label Muslim democracy is a kind of party political branding meant to say, we are not anti-systemic. We are not aiming at a kind of authoritarian state in which Islamist parties monopolize all power. We are a party that's committed to democratic pluralism, and you should see us like you see Christian democratic parties throughout Europe. Parties that have a kind of socially conservative base, but are flexible on issues of economics and are fundamentally committed to the idea of constitutional rule. So therefore, don't be scared of us and please don't repress us. So that's one way of framing it. And there have been thinkers like Sayyid Vali Nasr or Asif Bayat, who have emphasized this idea that Muslim democracy should not be seen in ideological terms, that it's a kind of post-ideological phase of the Islamist movement, post-ideological or even post-Islamist, that Islamist parties are no longer committed to their own distinct conception of the state, their own distinct conception of the political, their own distinct conception of constitutions, justice, law, so on and so forth, but are fundamentally pragmatic with regards to the political system in which they find themselves and focus more on electoral competition, good governance, and bringing into the electoral fold certain kinds of socially conservative segments of the population that may have been excluded. So that's the kind of background framing and association that a lot of scholars and journalists and observers have. Now, in the Tunisian context, everybody will be familiar with the well-known declaration at the 2016 Party Congress of the Ennahda Party, in which they declared to no longer be a part of political Islam and to have embraced something called Muslim democracy. Now, one way of understanding this is precisely the way that I just elaborated, that this is Ennahda being pragmatic. It's trying to achieve recognition both by outside powers like European and international powers, as well as local domestic competitors, that we are not a radical party. We are not aiming to monopolize political power. We're not aiming at a an Islamic state. And it's also could also be understood as sort of acknowledging political reality. After the 2011 revolution, there was a lengthy 2.5 or 3 year constituent period in which all of the parties to the Constituent Assembly drafted a new constitution that was ultimately adopted in 2014. And this constitution, while it included certain kinds of provisions like the religion of the state is Islam and the president has to be Muslim, had no reference to the Islamic Sharia, did not refer to the state as an Islamic state. It referred to the nature of the state as a republic. And the Constitution, in any fair reading, is a fairly secular form of rule. So the other way of understanding this is that unlike in authoritarian transitions, for example, in the long transition in Turkey, perhaps Mustafa can speak more authoritatively about this, there was never a single revolution. There was never a break with the old order. There was never a single constituent moment. There was never a democratic period in which at once the new state was created. This happened over a long period of time through various kinds of points of negotiation and conflict between the AKP and the Kemal state. In the case of Tunisia, what's significant is that you had the Islamist party, or perhaps multiple Islamist parties, if you consider Tayyar al-Mahabba to be in this category, actually participating in a completely open and free democratic transition in which they were the co-authors of what has to be regarded as a secular constitution. So the other way of understanding this declaration that we are now a Muslim Democratic Party is as a recognition of reality, that Ennahda was a party that had participated with other political parties in creating a new political order. Some of them in the early period, the so-called revolutionary parties, but after the crisis year of 2013 and 14, engaging in political cooperation with the party that represented the interests or the personnel of the ancien regime. And so this was sort of a pragmatic recognition of the electoral strategy and attitude of Ennahda. So that's all very well and good, but then we have some questions. What does this mean for a movement and a party, and particularly a leader like Ghannouchi, that was traditionally distinguished by its ideological orientation? And so historically, Islamism cannot be reduced to any particular class, interest, or orientation. It cannot be reduced to any particular ethnic orientation. It cannot usually be reduced to geographic or urban rural distinctions. All of these factor in various countries, but Islamism makes no sense except as a grand idea, as an ideological stance towards law, constitutionalism, forms of rule, modernity, economics, so on and so forth. So there is this question. What is Muslim democracy as an ideology? What is Muslim about it? What is democratic about it? And how is Muslim democracy to be understood or compared to previous iterations of Islamist ideology? So we've discussed in this platform before the translation of Sheikh Rashid's Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which we discussed as representation of his views today. But in reality, there's a very, very large break between the views articulated in Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which calls for a state that is democratic, which calls for a state that guarantees public liberties and rights, which calls for a state that is in many cases tolerant of not only non-Muslims in the religious sense, but of non-Islamic political agendas and ideologies, but nonetheless builds the conception of politics around a fundamental assumption of moral unity within the polity. Public freedoms in the Islamic State assumes that the vast majority of a people, whether it's understood specifically as related to Tunisia or Morocco or Jordan or whatever, or just in general, how Islam imagines politics, it assumes a people, the vast majority of which shares a moral unity around the truth of Islam, around the desirability of Islam, around the emancipatory potential of Islam and Islamic law, and imagines a way in which this people, a pious people, a praying people, a religious people, a people that sees itself as God's Khalifa or Caliph on earth, can govern itself democratically, not governed by military rulers, not governed by kings, and not governed by scholars, can govern itself democratically, but also piously. That is very different from the assumptions about politics that go into the defense and explanation of the post-2014 Tunisian political constitution. That is a political order in which all of those assumptions are replaced. Instead, the basic assumptions of politics are radical pluralism. Tunisia is constituted politically, and not only because of authoritarian restraints, but when you let the people vote democratically by radical secularists, by communists, by radical Salafis, by feminists, by neoliberal business elites, by people that are hostile to the idea of Islam in the public sphere. That is the foundation of politics. So Muslim democracy, not only at the pragmatic or party political level, but also at the intellectual, moral, and religious level, is fundamentally a response to that fact, that you do not begin with a grand assumption that we are all here basically Muslims. And so that's what's interesting. That's what's interesting about the turn to Muslim democracy, because it's a turn from what political theorists sometimes call ideal theory. What is justice or legitimacy for the world as it ought to be, versus non-ideal theory? What is an acceptable mode of politics for the world as we find it? So that's what I was interested in. And I'm probably down to a few minutes. So let me walk through the book and then say a few things about my own observations and conclusions. So the first is a fairly lengthy introduction by me, in which I discuss Sheikh Rashid's career and this transition from what I call Islamic democracy as represented in public freedoms in the Islamic State to Muslim democracy as represented in a number of other essays, not only published after 2011, but particularly after that period. Then, in collaboration with Sheikh Rashid, we identified some of the most important essays to translate. Some of these occur before 2011. So a number of them are about the concept of freedom, basic freedoms in Islam, freedom first. And these are very important and I would say sophisticated essays that I think political theorists should be very interested in, because they discuss the different ways in which Islam grapples with the conception of freedom. We're all familiar with the traditional utopian Islamist conception in which Islam is freedom because Islam liberates you from your desires, from your whims, from a secular society, from things that are against Islam. And the Sharia liberates you through the realization of your higher self and your higher purpose. That is still there. But Sheikh Rashid also considers the ways in which basic negative freedom or liberal freedom or legal freedoms also have a religious value in Islam. The freedom not only to be your best pious self, but the freedom to choose or not to choose religious obligations. The freedom to be free from authoritarian domination. The freedom to be free from fear of the state. So these are very sophisticated essays in which lots of the things that we identify with neither secular authoritarianism nor the Islamic utopian ideal of perfection are given a kind of religious valence. Sheikh Rashid also talks about, exactly as the second essay implies, the dialectic of unity, difference, and political pluralism. One of the commonalities of Islamic political thought throughout the 20th century is this assumption that the people are actually religious. Any disagreement or difference or radical pluralism or secularism is an aberration. It's imposed by colonialism, it's imposed by imperialism, or it's imposed by secular elites. So you don't have to think about questions like, what if the people actually desire things other than Islam? And so he's grappling in a very sophisticated way with how Islamic political thought is committed to various kinds of unity, but has to take seriously facts of difference in political pluralism. An essay that I am very excited about, between Sayyid Qutb and Malik Benebi. Those that are not as deeply into Islamic political thought or don't read Arabic as well may have heard of Sayyid Qutb and may think that, well, Islamists are all fundamentally inspired by Qutb and Maududi and those kinds of thoughts. And that's not a lie. If you read Political Freedoms in the Islamic State, Sheikh Rashid takes very seriously Sayyid Qutb. He takes very seriously Abul Ala Maududi from India and Pakistan. But he also talks about how the Algerian historian and theorist of civilization Malik Benebi was a formative influence on him from an early period. And so how to think about Islamic political thought between these two very different thinkers is a fascinating essay. And in fact, close readers of Islamic political thought may remember that Qutb himself disparages and dismisses Benebi, not by name. He refers to an Algerian theorist of civilization. And so Ghannouchi, as one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, late 20th, early 21st century theorist of Islam and politics, navigating these two thinkers is a very, very important statement. In Islam and Citizenship, he again talks about the value of deep pluralism and how certain kinds of classical assumptions about citizenship versus dhimma, or the way in which membership in the demos or is fundamentally the same as membership in the ummah. That to be a member of the Islamic community is to be a member of the political community. And so grappling with these facts of difference is something that he's been thinking about well before 2011. The last three essays are very important, very influential. And chapter 8 was actually published in translation earlier by CSID, and with kind permission, we republished it. I edited the translation a little bit, but the last three are really great because these are the main places, in my experience, where Ghannouchi addresses the post-2014 constitution. All of their differences from a classical Islamic conception. And he's very clear. There's no mention of Sharia. There's all that business about how to talk about gender relations, whether it's equality or complementarity. What does it mean to say that Western human rights are universal? And he addresses these things, and he addresses the fact that there were some serious compromises made about language and substance in the Constitution, but how that's justified. And so I think that together, all of these essays are going to give a good sense of what is Muslim democracy as a distinct way of thinking about politics, thinking about political communities, thinking about law, thinking about democracy. And then most of the book is actually a lengthy dialogue between Sheikh Rashid and myself that occurred over about a week in his home, in which I, as an admirer and close reader of his writings, had the opportunity to spend time discussing his ideas, discussing his intellectual formulation, reading out loud together passages from his various works and discussing them philosophically, but also pressing him on some of these issues related to pluralism, the meaning of democracy, continuity between previous conceptions of Islamic thought and his present views. So I hope that it's very difficult to summarize this, but I hope that lots of people will read it and gain from it and feel that some aspects of his thinking were moved along by this. I want to conclude by, that's us chit-chatting. I want to conclude by answering the question that I began with, which is, what is Muslim about Muslim democracy? So in this slide, you have a pretty clear distinction between the 2 points of view. And you'll see what's interesting is that these views were published very close together. So it's not like there's the Ghanoushi of the 80s and 90s that's committed to an Islamic state, and then there's the Ghanoushi of the 2000s that is moderated. There's a lot of overlap between these views. But if you look at these two different quotes, you see that there is this long-standing view that the Islamic State is anti-authoritarian because it upholds the rule of law, but that law is the Islamic law, because the Islamic law is not human. It's not arbitrary. It's objective. It's separate from political interests. And it's not given by the state and by rulers, and that's what gives it its authority. But then, not much later, you'll see this question that, well, in Islam, there's no church. There's no authority that can tell people what Islam is and what does it mean to have an Arab Islamic identity. And so that can only ever be determined by the people, but not by some idealized people, but the actual people that exist and are governing themselves. And so, in my view, there are 5 kind of particular features of the ideology of Muslim democracy. The first is that politics is a kind of social contract. It's not seen as just a contract between the ummah and God. It's a contract between people that are governing themselves. And the subject of that contract is not the akhirah, not the next life, not moral perfection, but our worldly goods and interests that we have in common. Second is that the recognition of the fact of pluralism. Politics is constituted by this radical disagreement. And it makes no sense to wish that the disagreement were different. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if the only disagreement were between Muslims, Jews, and Christians? Because that's the way that classical fiqh tradition talks about it. No, the actual pluralism of a society gives you the contours of politics, and that's what you need to deal with. Third, the purpose of politics is to avoid more evil things. Politics is not about perfection. It's not about becoming God's caliph on earth. It's not about destroying Jahiliyyah. It's not about destroying kufr. Politics is about avoiding the evils of dictatorship and authoritarianism and the lack of democracy. And the way to do that is through agreement and consensus. And so all politics has a conception of friends and enemies or self and other. But in this conception, the friends and enemies are not just determined in terms of religious identification, but where do you stand on democracy? If you're committed to democracy, for us as well as for yourself, even if you're secular, you can be a friend in that sense. But if you're opposed to democracy, whether you're secular or regard yourself as religious, that puts you on the other side of our antagonism. Fourth, there are some very interesting statements about what the Islamic Sharia is. In public freedoms in the Islamic State, it's very complicated, but Sheikh Rashid takes seriously the textual tradition, the text of Islam, the tradition of interpretation, and the need to think about what is the most pious way of formulating law. In some of his statements after 2014, Sharia is just limited government. Whatever limits authoritarianism, that is Sharia. Now, you might ask, what is Islamic about all this? Or what is Muslim about all of this? And the answer is Medina. the single most common justification for this kind of politics based on pluralism, based on a focus on worldly goods, is the Covenant of Medina. And in that interpretation, Medina was a pluralist state. There were Muslims and non-Muslims. It was created not on the basis of divine command, but on the basis of agreement, covenant, contract between tribes and parties. And the object of the agreement was worldly goods and interests. And so Sheikh Rashid says that a number of points. We Muslims are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state. So we have this model for seeing politics as a matter of contract between people that disagree about religion over shared worldly interests. And the message there is kind of, if it's good enough for the Prophet, it's good enough for us. I'm going to end here. I have a number of ways of interpreting how do we think about Muslim democracy as an ideology. Maybe we can come back to that. But I think I'd like to stop here and then hear what my colleagues have to say.